So I'll piggyback on what Sean has been getting us started with, and good morning to everybody. Thank you for hauling out early this morning after I think a lot of people had a late night last night. And so picking up on my introduction, Howie's generous introduction, I have trained and practiced as a medical doctor for decades, and yes, now I am practicing political medicine rather than clinical medicine because it is the mother of all illnesses, and I regard what I'm doing in many ways as administering political therapy and helping people break up with an abusive relationship, an abusive political relationship that hasn't gotten us where it promises and makes all kinds of excuses, and then people start making excuses for their political abuser. But for reasons I think that bring us to this room, it's really important to rethink this relationship and what it is that we need in order to even survive, let alone thrive. So I want to say just a few words about the climate crisis and where it stands today, which is very different from where it stood even a year ago. And how that reflects on what we can do under this current free market system that is accelerating, actually, in the wrong direction. So I'll say a few words about that, and then I want to talk very briefly about sort of how we could do this. What is the emergency program that it would take to scale up in order to meet this emergency? So you may be well aware that every month in this year now has set a new all-time high record for that month in terms of temperature. We're seeing not only this apocalyptic fire in Alberta, Canada, which, to put it mildly, is unbelievably ironic that there in tar sands country, where one of the largest assaults on the climate is taking place, climate change is coming back with a vengeance, as if Mother Earth were rousing to say, you can't do this, you've got to stop. We have the new heat waves in India that you may have heard about, with temperatures in the 120s, and that's just the heat temperature. I haven't heard what the humidity is, because when you have humidity on top of heat, it makes the effective temperature then actually much higher. And they say it's like opening a hot oven just to sort of be in the air there. And this is going to be the average heat wave in the climate that we're going to. About 2 weeks ago, there was an announcement made by a senior scientist of NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And this announcement was made at a national conference of insurance agencies, and it was not widely covered. It was covered in their professional journal online and maybe one other place. But what NOAA announced at that conference was that they had just received an oh my God report from the Antarctic, from the West Antarctic sheet. Basically the latest science documenting that the breakup is going much faster than even the latest science had predicted. About a year ago, Jim Hansen had put out a study predicting that as soon as 5 decades from now, in the 2060s basically, we could see not just 10, but 20, 30, and 40 feet of sea level rise if we didn't profoundly change course. And this is essentially what the new data that the NOAA administrator was referring to, that said, that basically advanced the timeline to say that by 2050 we could see 9 feet of sea level, which means, half of Manhattan will be underwater. It also means that we will lose all coastal cities and ports. So if you're worried about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, no worries. There will be no maritime trade. There will be no ports from which trade will take place. But unfortunately, that means no population centers either. And if we think we have trouble right now with 40 million refugees, I think it is now, the global refugee count related to poverty and war and climate change, it's about 40 million. we're talking hundreds of millions of refugees at a minimum. So this is not a sustainable hit. This is not something we will be able to survive. And I know that there are some nuclear power plants that are actually at sea level, which will be flooded, and we are looking at about 24 or so Fukushimas. There's one near my house, Pilgrim Power Plant, and I went to look up what's its sea level elevation. Well, it's at 0. Nuclear power plants need a lot of cooling, that's why they're at 0 sea level elevation. And you know, in order to decommission a nuclear power plant, you have to start way in advance. So that's one other thing we have to start right now, is decommissioning our nuclear plants as well as decommissioning our fossil fuel plants. So this is stuff that we need to do now. We can't put this off. This is immediate, and it's really important, I think, for us to be just clear about what the terms of the crisis are. One other little factoid I want to convey, and this came out just last week also, a review of what our global levels of CO2 and methane are right now. So the rise in CO2 levels, that is the parts per million of carbon dioxide, is actually accelerating. It used to be going up by about 1.5 or 2 parts per million per year. Now we've hit a new all-time record. It's now going up by 3 parts per million per year. And here's what is, I think, most concerning of all. Methane levels the increase in methane levels has basically doubled as well. So in other words, the rise in methane has now gone up 100% over the baseline of the last many years, which could just be, variation, but it's not likely to be, because, we are fracking up a storm right now, and we know that fracking leaks methane. The other very worrisome possibility is that this rise in methane represents an accelerated meltdown now of the permafrost under the oceans and in the Arctic. That is basically the carbon bomb of nightmare proportions, because, as you may know, methane in the short term is about 70 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. So this so-called methane bomb, represented by the melting of the frozen methane in the so-called permafrost, is extremely dangerous. So all these are reasons why this is not something that should be left up to private companies who not only have a stake and a conflict of interest about carbon reductions, but they're legally obliged to make greatest profit on their dollar. So I think this underscores that it's essential that we move to the kinds of systems you'll be hearing us talk about today for actually managing our energy resources as a public good. And I'll just say a quick word about the Green New Deal, which is our proposal for how we do this. In the 1930s, we recognized that we had an economic emergency. Well, for most people, we still have that economic emergency. And we have on top of that a climate emergency. So it turns out you can solve them both together through a New Deal type program, but in this case it's green, in order to transition our energy, our food system to a sustainable, locally based and healthy food system, as well as our transportation, which is a major source of carbon emissions, moving to a largely public transportation system, including safe bike paths and safe sidewalks, so that we can include muscle power transportation that dovetails with our public transit. As well as ecosystem restoration as part of restoring critical infrastructure. If you do this, you save so much money by the health improvements from preventing pollution that it essentially pays for itself just in terms of those health benefits. And this is well documented in reports put out by Mark Jacobson from Stanford. And I'll mention also the country of Cuba was the living evidence of this when their oil pipeline went down in the early 1990s. Their death rates, because they had no pollution, they moved to a healthy, largely plant-based, organic food system overnight, and they used muscle-powered and public transit. Their death rates from diabetes went down 50% almost overnight, and their death rates from heart attacks and strokes went down about 30%. So for us, we spend $3 trillion a year, not on a healthcare system, on a sick care system, because corporate America is very busy making us sick through those systems. By transforming them rapidly, we can basically pay the cost of transition. In addition, a Green New Deal, besides reviving the economy, turning the tide on climate change, it also makes wars for oil obsolete and enables us to basically massively cut our military budget, which is largely about securing fossil fuel and energy resources and their routes of transportation. And in doing that, we can also plug back in another $500 billion into making this transition and lead the way to demilitarizing all of our budgets, not just the US, but Russia and China, whose economies are also very much hurting, and who are also really struggling with the consequences of climate change right now. So this is a win-win-win for all of us. All we need is the courage of our convictions to insist that we will accept nothing less than a world in which we can survive and thrive. Thank you.